Pick up here. The Supreme Court of Appeal has declared the legal definition of hate speech unconstitutional. It says a comment is hate speech only if it causes harm and incites violence. The ruling could have far-reaching consequences. To discuss this, I'm joined by Matodzi Ratshimbilani, and he's a director at TGR Attorneys. Mr. Ratshimbilani, thank you very much for making the time to speak to us. So, a comment is only hate speech if it causes harm or incites violence. What about hatred, though?
Well, I think maybe just for context, I mean, the freedom of expression as contained in Section 16 of the Constitution has always been a highly contested, right. Because often when one says something about the other, I'm likely to be unhappy about it. Some people may find it defamatory. But I think what is at issue here is that the Constitution is quite clear. It excludes, out of the right of freedom of expression, expressions that incite harm. So in other words, if the Constitution contemplated that if you say something, it might be true, but if it incites harm to me, that should be prohibited. But
why the consideration only harm, or why is more emphasis being placed on incitement to violence? What about prejudice? I may say something that will cause people to hate you. Hence I asked the word, what about hatred?
Yes, look, as I was saying earlier, that the drafters of the Equality Act, which was intended to expand on the freedom of expression right, amongst other things, included hatred, and they also included hatefulness. So in other words, if you say something that hurts me,
there we go.
They included it within the parameters of things that were unconstitutional, but on reading the Constitution closely, it doesn't go that far. It does not, because once we talk about hatefulness, you start being subjective. What hurts you may not hurt me. But the essence of the judgment is to say the Equality Act was more generous. It pulls it back strictly into what the Constitution says, which is incitement of harm.
Is there recourse for convicted racists like Xoli Mngambi, for example? I think of other names, Adam Katsavelos, Penny Sparrow. Is there recourse for them based on this judgment now that has come from the Supreme Court of Appeal, or do they not stand a chance at all?
Look, for starters, for cases that are already settled, this will not help because the decisions have been made. They cannot be reopened on the basis of development in case law.
Even though they were convicted on the basis of the same piece of legislation?
That is correct. For as long as the cases are closed, they cannot be reopened. But it's important to note that not all of them were based on hate speech. For example, from my understanding, the Xoli Mngambi case, it's criminal injurious, so it's the impairment of the dignity of the people that she was talking to. That's a common law crime. You're not entitled to do that to me, to impair my dignity, and that doesn't go away. What is important here is a narrow definition as contained in the Equality Act, which is commonly referred to as hate speech.
The drafters of these pieces of legislation, Mr. Ratshimbilani, are they to blame, or is it what is intended anyway, that pieces of legislation or laws are meant so that, or are created so that they are challenged, such as what we are seeing now?
Look, it's always difficult. If you put yourself in the shoes of the drafters, one drafts these things in anticipating the future. So sometimes the usage of language may be informed by, what one sees around them. But in hindsight, as the judge Nafsa clearly says, to say, for example, if they talk about hatefulness, that was not part of what's in the Constitution. They may have read, the incitement of harm to include hatefulness. So one would say, maybe they overextended a bit, but that's normal. You draft legislation, it goes through various processes. There are many people. It's actually drafted by committees. There's public comment. So one wouldn't put fault on them, but that's why the courts are here to interpret and to refine the legislation as we go along.
Matodzi Ratshimbilani, thank you very much for making the time to speak to us here. He is with the TGR Attorneys, a director there.